For the light of your love is shining in the midst of the darkness shining. Jesus, light of the world, shine upon us. Set us free by the truth you now bring us. Shine on me. Shine on me. Shine, Jesus, shine. Fill this land with the Father's glory. Blaze, Spirit, blaze. Set our hearts on fire. Flow, river, flow. Flood the nations with grace and mercy. Send forth your word, Lord, and let there be light.
Good morning and welcome to Let the Bible Speak. My name is Alex Meredith. I'm a minister for the Marquette Church of Christ here in Marquette, Michigan, here in the UP. We are continuing our series, The Crown, today. We've been talking about the lives of Saul and David. We've been looking at the early years of the Israelite monarchy a few thousand years ago, right? So we're pulling a lot of really powerful and interesting lessons from this text that we see back in the Old Testament in 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. Now, where we are today, we've seen Saul, the first king of Israel, and his appointment as the first king. Then we talked about some of his subsequent failures and his rejection by God as king. Following that, we talked about David's private anointing by Samuel the prophet, and then some of David's early life and his slow rise in popularity and rise of influence, and Saul's slow fall of influence as well. We talked last week about David's opportunity to actually take Saul's life while Saul was seeking his life, and David chose to spare his life. So Saul has David on the run, and he's been on the run for a while. So that's kind of the context of where we're at right now and where we're coming at our text for today. First, I want to bring your attention to something that's been going on in the world and really in our nation in the last few years. Many of you are aware that this has been a big issue lately. Because over the last few years, especially in the United States, there have been several monuments that have been taken down. There have been high schools, streets, even other public buildings that are changing names, right? You see names like George Washington, Christopher Columbus, Robert E. Lee. They're beginning to disappear from the public eye, right? Now, why is this happening? Well, it's primarily because there are people who are discovering that these once esteemed historic leaders, people they were told they should look up to, they're discovering that these people were flawed, right? This is happening all over the country and everywhere, right? I'm sure many of you are aware of cases like this, even locally, right? I know there is a push to rename Marquette High School's mascot. So this is something that's even affected our own community. Now, you think about George Washington, right? He was said to have owned more than 100 slaves himself. Christopher Columbus is said to have supposedly tortured Native Americans in his quest for gold in the New World. You think about Robert E. Lee. He fought against federal emancipation of slaves. All that we're seeing when we see, these images of people like came out last spring, by the way. There were these images and videos coming out of people tying ropes around a statue of Andrew Jackson in Lafayette Square. They were tying ropes around him and trying to pull down the statue. What exactly are we seeing there? Well, what we're seeing is people trying to process this really strange phenomenon by which you are suddenly confronted with the truth of your heroes are flawed, or the people you were at least told to look up to, they've got some skeletons in the closet. Sometimes this comes in the form of a historical figure. Sometimes it's a celebrity, right? You've maybe heard the saying, never meet your heroes. You might be disappointed to learn who they really are. Sometimes it's even a family member. And sometimes you discover that these people that you once looked up to, they're messed up. And it's really jarring. It's a really jarring experience. And people don't know how to deal with those emotions. And sometimes they lash out by trying to tear monuments down. It can take different forms and different shapes. But it comes down to really that discovery of heroes being flawed. That happens in the church all the time too, by the way. It seems like almost every few weeks there's a new scandal coming out, a new name that's brought forth for everyone to hear, where some preacher or pastor is caught up in some scandal, right? I think about names like Eddie Long, Ted Haggard, even Martin Luther King Jr., by the way, who was a Baptist preacher. FBI surveillance done on him for rather nefarious purposes, albeit. But that FBI surveillance discovered that Martin Luther King was having a number of extramarital affairs. And there's something really and especially jarring about faith leaders falling. I mean, it's like, who can you trust if not them? If even they are unreliable and shock you with their flaws, who can you trust? It's really a reminder that nobody is infallible and everybody is vulnerable to the tactics of Satan himself. The text that we're going to be looking at today is in 1 Samuel chapter 27. 1 Samuel chapter 27. Again, just a reminder, Saul has been rejected at this point. He is still technically king, but David is beginning to rise in the ranks, and Saul is jealous of the attention that David is getting, so he's in pursuit of his life, and he's been in pursuit of his life for a long time now. Over this span, Saul has attempted to take David's life at least 10 different times. David has spared Saul's life in that same span at least twice. But David is tired of running, right? David is tired of running, and he might even be a little afraid. So this is 1 Samuel chapter 27. We are going to read the whole chapter, but it's quite short. I think it's only 12 verses. So let's start reading at the beginning. Then David said in his heart, "Now I shall perish one day by the hand of Saul. There is nothing better for me than that I should escape to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will despair of seeking me any longer within the borders of Israel, and I shall escape out of his hand." So David arose and went over, and he and the 600 men who were with him, to Achish, the son of Maok, king of Gath. And David lived with Achish at Gath, he and his men, every man with his household, and David with his 2 wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail of Carmel, Nabal's widow. And when it was told Saul that David had fled to Gath, he no longer sought him. Then David said to Achish, "If I have found favor in your eyes, let a place be given me in one of the country towns that I may dwell there. For why should your servant dwell in the royal city with you?" So that day Achish gave him Ziklag. Therefore Ziklag has belonged to the kings of Judah to this day. And the number of the days that David lived in the country of the Philistines was 1 year and 4 months. Now David and his men went up and made raids against the Geshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites, for these were the inhabitants of the land from of old, as far as Shur, to the land of Egypt. And David would strike the land, and would leave neither man nor woman alive, but would take away the sheep, the oxen, the donkeys, the camels, and the garments, and come back to Achish. When Achish asked, "Where have you made your raid today?" David would say, "Against the Negev of Judah, or against the Negev of the Jerahmeelites, or against the Negev of the Kenites." And David would leave neither man nor woman alive to bring news to Gath, thinking, lest they should tell about us and say, "So David has done." Such was his custom all the while he lived in the country of the Philistines. And Achish trusted David, thinking, "He has made himself an utter stench to his people Israel. Therefore he shall always be my servant." This is not a portion of text that is normally focused on when we look at the life of David, and for obvious reasons. So you start at the beginning, and what we see is that David, he's afraid, right? Saul has been seeking his life for some time now, and he's scared. Who wouldn't be, right? So he's afraid, and he flees to Philistia, but not just on his own. It says that he takes 600 of his men and their families with him, right? So he's subjecting all these other people to his fear as well, in a sense. And then once he arrives in Philistia, which, by the way, is out of the promised land. Well, I shouldn't say out of the promised land. It's a foreign nation that is actually partly on the promised land that Israel was supposed to be conquering and taking over, not allying with. So David goes over to Philistia, and he allies himself with a man named Achish, who is the king of Gath. This is rather ironic, considering that, you know who else is from Gath? Goliath, the Philistine that he triumphantly defeated just a few chapters ago, really. And now he's going to Goliath's hometown and allying himself with the king there and cooperating with him and helping them. And according to Achish, making him an utter stench to the people of Israel. It's really quite remarkable, and not in a good way. Achish, at David's request, gives him the town of Ziklag to live in, which is on the eastern end of the territory of Philistia, near the border of Israel. And all the while he's living there, we're told that he's there for a total of about 16 months. All the while he's there, he is pillaging on behalf of the Philistines. And it said that he killed everyone, and he stole the livestock and stole their property. So he's doing some really serious stuff here. Now, when you look at the story as a whole, there are, as I see it, about two really questionable decisions that David makes. First of all, there's a decision to move from Israel to Philistia, and then there's the whole matter of him destroying and pillaging various villages, including villages that lie within the region of Judah, which includes the Israelite people. Now, addressing this first problem, the first question, his move to Philistia. God never told David to go to Philistia. David was on the run from Saul, and at no point, in the section that we read at least, at no point does it say, and David consulted God, right? He didn't pray about it. He didn't consult God about it. He didn't wait for a sign from God to go. It just says that he's afraid, and he went, right? In verse 1, I shall perish one day by the hand of Saul. He's afraid. And acting on that fear, he goes to Philistia. So, on the other hand, you might say, well, God never condemns David's actions. That's, to me, the really shocking part of this passage. There's no point when God comes into the picture and says, David, what are you doing? What have you done? You don't see that here. At least as far as I've read, I don't remember a time when David is ever directly criticized for this particular action. So he never asked permission, but he's also never directly condemned. In many ways, this reminds me of what we see back in Genesis chapter 12. We're not going to read there at the moment, but back in Genesis chapter 12, you might remember after the Abrahamic covenant was sealed in verses 1 through 3, it says that Abram, as he was called at the time rather than Abraham, but it's the same man, Abram and Sarai, they go to the land of Canaan, the land that was promised to him and to his descendants, the same land that David is on now. They were living in Canaan, and then there was a famine. There was no food. And so, because of that famine, Abram decides to take he and his whole family and the whole group of people who were with him down to Egypt. And in that case, God never told Abram to go down to Egypt. In fact, earlier in the chapter, he said, go to the land that I will show you, referring to the land of Canaan. So he goes to this land, and then all of a sudden things go wrong, and he abandons the land, and he goes to Egypt. Now, when he goes to Egypt, this is when Abram gets in a lot of trouble, right? This is where they enter a town, and Abram's afraid because Sarai, his wife, was quite beautiful. And out of fear, sounds familiar, out of fear, he tells the people there, this is my sister. Because he thought, he said, if this is my wife, they were just going to kill him and take the wife, take Sarai. And so he tells them, this is my sister. You almost have a case of adultery pop up, and all of a sudden God intervenes in the whole situation, gives this remarkable dream to the person about to commit adultery with Sarai, and all of a sudden the situation is fixed. And again, at no point did God say, this was a terrible idea, or yes, do this. God just comes into the situation and fixes everything. And something very similar happens with David. Because David comes in, again, didn't consult God, but was never told anything against it either. And after a while of committing these terrible atrocities, the Philistines eventually suspect that he's a spy and say, no, we don't want you here, please go away. And he eventually returns. And I wonder, maybe God was involved with that. And maybe that's even a reflection of the things that happen in our own lives, right? Maybe we're tempted to say, well, I wasn't struck by lightning, so I guess it must be okay. But then God slowly works and finds a way to get us out of that situation that's so harmful to us and the people around us. I'm kind of going on a rabbit trail here, but all in all, when you look at this move from Canaan to Philistia, from Judah to Philistia, it really seems like a move that is dictated a lot more by fear than it is by faith. Maybe he should have trusted that God would protect him. He was anointed the next king of Israel. Shouldn't he have the trust in God that it would be okay, that he has nothing to be afraid of, just like God protected him from Goliath? And at that time, remember, back in 1 Samuel, I think it was chapter 16, he was so confident that God had protected him against the lion and the bear, and so he's going to protect me now. But he had lost that confidence, right? Maybe he had forgotten what God had done for him. And maybe we do too. Now, regarding David's pillaging, because this is the big story here. We're told that he pillaged these different groups, right? The Geshurites, the Girzites, the Amalekites, and the Kenites. Now, all of these people, all of those groups that were just mentioned, they are not, in fact, Israelites. And many of these are inhabitants of the promised land, which had been given to the Israelites, of which, back in Joshua chapter 23, Joshua and God gave this command to the Israelites to continue conquering the rest of the land and then distribute it among the Israelite tribes. So you could kind of make a roundabout argument here that even though David's allying himself with Philistia for the time being, he's going out against these other groups and conquering them as he should have done, according to Joshua 23. But then you start thinking about the Israelites, right? Judah, the Jerahmeelites, that's a group of people of Israel, descendants of Israel. So these territories are places that refer specifically to people of Israel. And you notice, back in verse 11, it says that he would leave neither man nor woman alive, lest the news get around that David has done this, right? He didn't want word to get back to Judah or to Philistia and then to Judah. He didn't want word to get around that the supposed future king of Israel was killing Israelites. And as far as I can see it, I don't see any sort of justification here. There's no way to spin this to make this look right. As far as I see, what David did here was nothing short of murder. And on a really massive scale, right? Now, think about this for a second. How is David normally depicted? How is David normally depicted? Well, he's depicted as a Jewish hero, right? When you think about both biblical standards and worldly standards, he's depicted as a hero of the Jewish people, as, the best king ever. This is the icon of what perfect ruling looks like. Then you look at the biblical text, Acts 13:22, in reference actually to 1 Samuel 13:14, it calls David a man after God's own heart who will do all his will. And then we go to 1 Chronicles chapter 18, verse 14. David reigned over all Israel, and he administered justice and equity to his people. And then in 1 Chronicles 14:17, it says, the fame of David went out into all lands, and the Lord brought the fear of him upon all nations. Really, the whole book of Chronicles hardly says anything bad about David, right? Now, the reality is, the good things that are said about David, they're still true, right? David did a lot of good. He was a man after God's own heart, at least to some extent. But he was also deeply flawed, and he made a lot of mistakes. And if you continue to follow the narrative of David, which we're going to do over the next few weeks, you're going to see that he made a lot of mistakes. Some of them really, really bad ones, really serious ones. So when we look at this then, what's the message? What is the overarching message here? Well, there's certainly a moral lesson to be had about rash, emotional decisions that, shouldn't be made in the way that they were made. Most of David's actions here seem to be motivated more by fear rather than faith. But I think there's a bigger lesson embedded within this story, which is that David would not and could not be Israel's Savior. Let me explain a little what I mean here. At the end of the Judges era, and if you go and look at the book of Judges, Israel was a mess. At the very end of the book of Judges, it remarks how it was basically spiritual anarchy. Everybody was doing what they wanted to. So they were spiritually and morally lost. They were absolutely not in covenant relationship with God. God had made this covenant with them, and it was a conditional covenant, at least so it seemed. God was going to be their God, and they were going to live as his people. And they were not living as his people. And so they needed a faithful leader who could guide them back into that covenant relationship with God. Somebody who, according to Deuteronomy 17:19, which gives the qualifications for future king, would keep all the words of the law, not turning aside either to the right hand or to the left. Somebody who would be holy, and somebody who could lead Israel to be holy, so that God and man could dwell together again. And by the way, as we've talked about before on this show, that is really the whole story of the Bible. It's God trying to find a way for people to come be in his presence and for him to come into his presence, into their presence rather. What 1 Samuel 27 reveals to us is that David isn't it. He's good, but he's flawed. So someone else was going to have to step in. Someone else was going to have to fulfill this role. And that's just it. Nobody could do it. David couldn't do it. Solomon, David's son, he couldn't do it. Hezekiah and Josiah, two of the other great kings of Israel, neither of them could do it. And so eventually God's strategy would change. And this is really important. He stopped trying to find a righteous man and instead found a way to make man righteous. He stopped trying to find a righteous man and instead found a way to make man righteous. This plan is alluded to in 2 Samuel chapter 7, a passage known as the Davidic covenant that we're actually going to talk about in more detail next week. But it states that one of David's descendants would be the long-awaited perfect king of Israel, who would lead Israel back in the covenant relationship. Many of the prophets refer to this person as well, right? Not only 2 Samuel 7, but you think about Isaiah 53. You've got this image of the suffering servant and this leader who would make many to be accounted righteous. And this Savior figure became known as the Messiah. That's the Hebrew term for it. The Greek term is the word Christ. The one who would reunite God and man. And according to 2 Corinthians chapter 5, the man who would do that would be none other than Jesus himself. And David's imperfection, I think pretty ironically, is the basis for Messianic theology. It's the basis for understanding why Jesus had to come. It's the basis for understanding who Jesus is, right? Once you understand David's situation and his imperfection, all the rest, I think, comes in like puzzle pieces and makes the whole picture make sense, right? David couldn't do it. Solomon couldn't do it. Nobody else could do it. And then Jesus came and was perfect, was holy, only to be crucified by people that thought that he was that he was lying, or that he was wrong, or that he was a fake. But ironically, God, through that incredible story, secures our salvation through his death. David's flaws aren't too surprising when you think about it. You look at Romans chapter 3. I'll read a little of this to you. In Romans chapter 3, starting in verse 10, listen to this. None is righteous, no, not one. No one understands, no one seeks for God. All have turned aside. Together they have become worthless. No one does good, not even one. Their throat is an open grave. They use their tongues to deceive. The venom of asps is under their lips. Their mouth is full of curses and bitterness. Right? Everybody's messed up, including David. And the truth is, there is no person, there is no politician, there is no preacher or pastor out there who is perfect. None of them, no matter how many promises they try to make, can fix this world or your life. The only one who can do that is Jesus himself. Acts 4:12, right? There is salvation in no other name under heaven. Only Jesus. If you want to learn more, feel free to get in touch. We have a workbook series that you can work through. This is something hosted, or published, I should say, by World Bible School. They've got a 7-part workbook series that helps you get acquainted with the gospel and the Bible in general. If you're going to do that, you don't have a Bible, we offer one to you totally free of charge. Just let us know that you want one and want to participate. Our contact information is up on the screen. You can reach us at P.O. Box 372 in Marquette, Michigan 49855 by mail, or you can go to letthebiblespeak.net. I want to thank you so much for joining us today. I want to thank you for inviting me into your home and allowing this discussion to take place. Please join us next week on Let the Bible Speak.
The Father's glory blaze, Spirit blaze, set our hearts on fire. Flow, river, flow, flood the nations with grace and mercy. Send forth your word, Lord, and let there be